Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading issue number 172. But just a little catch-up before we get into that. John Constantine is supposedly dead. He has been burned alive inside of an S&M sex club. But I will say it has not been confirmed that this body is his for sure. And the man who's trying to find out if it is him is Agent Frank Turro, who's with the FBI. He was with John down here before this arc started, and I guess John went to the club and then burst into flames, and now he's got the case. Or I should say he's taken the case from the LAPD. So he's been interviewing a lot of the sex workers at the S&M dungeon, and each one has like an interesting story about John so far. Agent Turro has specifically interviewed two people, one man and one woman. It seems like the man did not like him very much, thought he was an asshole or arrogant or something. But the woman, Peggy, she thought John was the bee's knees, and she loved that he was like insatiable, and apparently him and her had some experiences where she would pour hot wax on him, and he loved it. But they didn't do it that night, so that's not why he burst into flames. And also in the background, we have S.W. Manor, this rich guy who apparently hated John for some reason. We don't know exactly why yet. But there is some connection because he has the fake Rasputin's clock that John had tricked someone to buy in a previous arc. And he's been walking around his house and talking about ghosts and stuff with this priest. Because earlier that night, while he was in the bathtub, he saw John Constantine reflected in the glass door of his restroom. And then when he looked around, no one was there. So currently he has Father Sean coming to his house and talking to him about this. And then also he has Fredo and all his other guards searching the house for John. And that's where we left off with the last issue. So first things first, with issue 172, we got the cover. There's a bunch of panels on this cover, like 10 or so, and each one has a different image. We see someone in S&M bondage gear. We see Agent Frank Turro on the phone. We see a limousine pulling up to, I guess, the front of a club or something. We see John Constantine smoking, of course, and someone is racking a gun, and a couple of the panels have chains in them. And we also see on this cover that this is written by Brian Azzarello with art by Marcelo Fruchin. And as we turn to the first page, we see what looks like the memory of someone who worked at the sex club. And we see John is surrounded by naked, beautiful women. He is dressed and smoking, of course, but he's just kind of standing in the center of them as they look like they're about to pounce on him. And that's exactly what they do. We see a couple of them jump onto John and begin licking his skin and then kissing him. And he's kissing back. And in the background, we see one of the other S&M dungeon workers looking very envious at John Constantine at this moment. And that worker is actually narrating these panels as he's being interviewed by Agent Turro. So his narration says, "Most people seem to like him, but then most people are fucking idiots." And then Agent Turro asks, "What about you, Graham?" And Graham answers, "What about me?" Then we turn the page and cut to the inside of the interview room, where Agent Turro is sitting across the table from Graham. And Graham is just an average-looking, kind of middle-aged white guy, except, of course, he's in an S&M bodysuit, the kind that's like all black and shiny, and then it zips up in the front, and it looks like his nipple piercings are coming through the front of it. And then he also has a lot of ear piercings, but other than that, if you just saw him from the neck up, he looks pretty standard, just a white guy who's older with short hair. So to Graham's question back of what about him, Agent Turro snaps back, "What were you fucking when the fire started?" And Graham, who's smoking, leans forward and says, "I wasn't. This stuck-up Hollywood bitch. I thought she needed some discipline. Ever since she won that Golden Globe, been acting like her shit don't stink. Well, let me tell you, when I was pulling them Benoit balls out of her ass, they sure..." But he's cut off by the next question of Agent Turro, who looks kind of annoyed and says, "You're not a member of the club, are you?" And Graham answers, "No, I just work there. It pays the bills. I'm in between gigs." And Turro asks, "What kind of gigs?" And Graham answers, "Movies. I'm an actor." And Turro says, "Really? I go to the movies. You been in any movies I've seen?" And Graham answers, "Stone City. I was the waiter. And Frank asks, that came out what, 5 years ago? And at that, Graham's demeanor kind of changes. He was kind of happy that they're talking about his career at first. But then when Agent Turo said, did that come out 5 years ago? He kind of slumps back down in the chair and says, something like that. It fucking stinks, man. I mean, I bust my hump, but I ain't no sweet dude or Jewish. So I can't get a part to save. But his thought is cut off as Turo interrupts asking, the waiter? And Graham confirms, yeah, I was the waiter. And Turo asks, in Stone City. The Chuck Segal picture. One about the lawyer who's framed by his client? Goes all karate on his ass at the end? And Graham looks excited that maybe Agent Turo saw him and remembers him, and he says, yeah, man, I was the waiter. But he's quickly disappointed as Agent Turo says, well, fuck me, but I don't remember no waiter. And as he says this last line, there's been a fly that's been flying around the room, and it happened to land on the lip of Agent Turo's coffee cup. So as he said, I don't remember no waiter, he's able to quickly smash the fly with his thumb, which that's pretty impressive to catch a fly and smash it on the lip of your coffee cup. Also, it's very gross. But as he looks disgusted at his thumb with fly guts all over it, he says, and I don't care about no actress, no balls going in the outdoor, no queer Jew Hollywood conspiracy, or no talent turd playing a waiter in some B movie when he's much better suited to be in one in real life. What I do care about is a body burned so fucking hot that I got a snowball's chance in hell getting a DNA reading off of it. That's what I care about. And then he narrows his eyes and he leans forward and says, now, if we're done talking about you, and you better believe we are, let's talk about that. Then we turn the page and we cut back to S.W. Manor's house, and him and Father Sean are still in the room of all the curiosities and what look like pagan statues and stuff. And S.W. is saying to Father Sean, your faith, Father, does it allow for ghosts? And Father Sean answers, ghosts, S.W.? You mean souls, spending their afterlife haunting the living? And S.W. adds, haunting? Good word. And Father Sean continues his answer, saying, no, when someone dies, their soul is judged, good deeds against the bad. And S.W. says, and depending on which side of the ledger is fuller, you either get to step through the pearly gates or into the gaping maw of hell for eternity. The spoon-fed party line, no exceptions. And Father Sean adds, there is purgatory. And S.W. says, man-made hope for the divinely hopeless. Your faith, it's one of thousands. How do you know you're backing the right horse? And Father Sean answers, you said it yourself, my faith. And S.W. continues, which says once a soul is judged, it either won't or can't commune with the living. Well, Father, I know your faith is wrong. And Father Sean does not like that, and he kind of gives S.W. a face, and he says, you mean you have faith that my faith is wrong? And S.W., who's been looking out a window this whole time, isn't staring at Father Sean. He's just saying, I choose my words very precisely, meaning I mean what I say. I know your faith is wrong. Then we turn the page, and we cut back to the interrogation room with Graham and Agent Turo, and Graham is saying, I don't know much about the guy, really. I tried to stay clear of him. And Turo asks, why's that, Graham? And Graham answers, he rubbed me the wrong way. And Turo throws in a little joke saying, little chafing? And Graham says, what? No, that's not what I meant. He was a fucking nobody. Just showed up on the scene one night, acted like he'd been down with it his whole life. Talking all high and mighty about clubs from Bangkok to Budapest. Bullshit. Constantine was a phony, but the bastard was always the center of attention. Everybody raved on and on about his technique. And it seems like Agent Turo likes to see Graham get riled up, so he says, for a man you steered clear of, you got a pretty strong opinion of him. And Graham thinks about that and says, yeah, well, I got a right to. Just after he started hanging around, I was working over a regular. Then we cut to a flashback of Graham about to whip a man hanging from the ceiling, but we can only see the man he's about to whip's back, and he's in silhouette. And Graham narrates over this. Let me rephrase that. An irregular. Most of the members say they're into pain. Well, they're not. they get off on the threat of it. But this particular guy, and in the background we can see other people getting spanked by paddles and people hanging so that their genitals and stuff are open to whoever might walk by. And even though the guy that's hanging from the ceiling about to be whipped by Graham is in silhouette, we turn the page, and the first thing said are the words, Mr. Manor. So the way that that's staged is it makes it seem like the guy hanging from the ceiling who is in silhouette, but he definitely has the body type of S.W. Manor. It's kind of confirmed just by the flow of the page turn that the guy's talking about some irregular guy, this particular guy, and then the next words are Mr. Manor. So we can kind of assume that S.W. Manor likes to go to this specific S&M club to get whipped by Graham or other people. And we also saw in the last issue that he had fresh whip marks on his back. So maybe he was at the club tonight. Well, like I said, we've turned the page and we're back with SW and Father Sean as they're talking in this room of curiosities. And Fredo has just come in and said, Mr. Manor. And SW answers, yes, Fredo. And Fredo answers, both the house and the grounds are secure. And SW says, you found nothing. And Fredo answers, you said we wouldn't. And SW says, and you said you wanted to be sure. So are you? And Fredo replies, yes. Are you certain you saw him? And SW says, as certain as you are that I didn't. Then Fredo says, wonderful. There's a feeding scheduled tonight. Would you like me to? And SW cuts him off saying, postpone it? Absolutely not. Come now, Father. Let's go for a nice walk and continue our conversation. Fredo, you and the lad stay close, I should mention that at the words feeding that Fredo was talking about, Father Sean has a look on his face like he doesn't want to know what that means. But it does sound like some kind of cannibal thing or something. So SW and Father Sean go to walk in his garden again under the full moon, and SW saying, have I ever told you how safe I feel during the night, Father? And Father Sean answers, yes. Yes, you have, a number of times. And SW says, oh, sorry. Unlike you, I forget sometimes. And then the father jokingly says, I forgive you. And he's got a little smirk on his face as he says that. But SW doesn't seem amused as he says, now, let's not jump the gun. You haven't heard my confession yet. And then he turns to the priest who was following him, and he holds onto his shoulders, and the priest says, I'm a bit concerned about that. And SW says, really? I thought you would be ecstatic. Giddy with anticipation even. What's so troubling? And the priest asks, why don't you tell me, SW? And SW says, right. It is my dime after all. My dime, my dollar, my billions. I buy and sell the world. Trouble with the world is, it's tangible, and sadly not worth owning. What's intangible, though, I can't buy that. I have to earn. And Father Sean asks, we dealing with ghosts again? And SW says, Father, I deal with ghosts every conscious minute, and most unconscious minutes as well. I've spent my life, not to mention a considerable amount of money, chasing ghosts. And now, I fear they're chasing me. Then we turn the page and we cut back to the interrogation room, but this time Graham is not there any longer, and in his place is a Latina woman with long brown hair, and she's wearing kind of similar clothes to what Peggy was wearing, where she's got a leather bustier on, but her breasts are hanging out, but she has tassels covering her nipples, unlike Peggy. And she's wearing thigh-high boots and long arm gloves. And unlike the rest of the people he's interviewed, she seems a bit more comfortable, I guess, because she's sitting on top of the table as Agent Frank Turro stands behind her on the other side of it. And she's saying, the pain was what he was really after. Get it? And Agent Turro says, enlighten me, Joey. And Joey says, Agent Turro, the greatest thing anybody can experience, and I mean everybody, is an orgasm. We all spend our lives crawling towards the next one. And Agent Turro asks, that right? And she answers, you know it is. But it was different for him. And Turro asks, John? And as he asks John, we see Agent Turro has moved around the table, and now he's staring directly at her, and she is now leaning on the back of a chair, and she answers, hell no. That boy? Jesus. Buckets. Both from him and anyone he touched. And Turro asks, including you? And Joey answers, Never. He teased. Made me want him more. And Turo asks, so who are we talking about? And Joey answers, Graham's client that night. The one he wouldn't give up. And then she pops herself back on the table, and I guess Turo has moved now to where she can look behind her and see him, and it looks like she's kind of getting in a pose that's flirting with him. And to her saying that the person she's going to talk about is the one that Graham wouldn't give up, Turo asks, you gonna? And Joey answers, I haven't made my mind up. And Turo says, that's the trouble with you pretty girls. And at the word girls, Joey gets a big smile on her face, and then she turns around and she asks Frank, can I show you something? And the way she's standing now, she has her breasts exposed, and her leg is up, kind of covering where her crotch would be. So it seems like she's going to flash him or something. And that's exactly what she does. She pulls down her leather panties, and we don't see what Frank sees, but he looks down and he says, so which is fake? That or the boobs? So from that, I think we're supposed to assume that Joey is a trans woman, and she just showed Agent Frank Turo her penis. Then she pulls up her underwear and she says, honey, once they figure out how to implant one of these, every body'll have one. And then she leans back against the table again, and she props one of her legs up on a chair so that she's kind of splayed open in front of him. And she says, God, I'm so turned on right now. And Agent Turo says, so turn on your mouth. And then Joey rubs her lips with her finger and says, that sounds fun. He never said what his name was. I guess he liked things mysterious. And Frank asks, kind of disappointed, so you don't know who he was? And Joey answers, I didn't say that. Such a beautiful face, but what an ugly, twisted soul. See, pain administered correctly can make sex so much more pleasurable. But for him, sex was punishing, a way to make pain excruciating. Graham was beating him. I kid you not, ripping the skin off his back. It was mesmerizing. I'd seen it 100 times before, but it was the first time for John. Now, I didn't say it because it kind of flowed directly into it, but this is a flashback we've cut to as she's been talking, so we're seeing the silhouette of who we can assume is S.W. Manor getting whipped by Graham over and over again, and it looks like he's really putting his all into it, and we see blood flying off the whip and the back. And then all of a sudden, a hand reaches out and grabs onto Graham's wrist, stopping him from whipping again, and it looks like the man he was whipping is hanging limp. So then we see John's silhouette take the whip, and he walks over to the dangling man, and he looks right at him, and this is where we see it is S.W. Manor's face, and John reaches out and grabs his face, and then he kisses him. Now, as S.W. raises his head to see who was in front of him, his eyes got very wide, and even more wide as John kissed him, and then as John lets go of the kiss, he says, hello, Stanley. So it seems even though this is John's first time at the club, this is not the first time he's met S.W. Manor. And that's because he did meet him in a previous arc. I totally forgot that the guy who was buying the Rasputin's clock was actually named Stanley. So this is supposed to be that man, the rich guy who was buying Rasputin's clock from John that they tricked all those years ago when John was a young lad. And that's why the name Stanley was dropped like ever so carefully every now and then, but most of the time everybody called him SW. So I actually had to go back and look at that issue to make sure the rich guy that was buying that was called Stanley, because I thought, oh, maybe this is just another person who bought the clock from the rich guy who John fooled, but this was the guy that John fooled. It was just 20 years ago. And also Guy Davis drew him first, and he looked a bit different than he does here, so that's also why I was a little confused. But the reason why SW is shocked right here is because this is after, supposedly, he had gotten John killed after the whole Lucky fiasco and John in prison. So he thought John was dead in prison, and now he's thinking either I'm seeing a ghost or something supernatural is going on. And as he stares in amazement at John in front of him, John says, happy to see me, are you? And then he pulls out a cigarette and he lights it. And as he does, Stanley says, Constantine, but you're... And John cuts him off saying, alive, mate, despite your best efforts. Alive, kicking, and on to the nasty little trick you tried to pull over on me. And SW says, but you died in prison. The riot. And then John gets closer to him and says, it was a good laugh, wasn't it? But truth is, I survived. Me death was a nasty little trick put over on you. Then we turn the page and we cut away from that flashback back to SW Manor or Stanley as he's talking to Father Sean, and he's saying, his voice was like butter, sizzling in a frying pan. His eyes, colder than the one staring back at me in the shaving mirror. The piper had come for his pound of flesh, and as he wrapped his surprisingly supple hands around it, alluding to John actually grabbing his penis in that flashback, and he continues, there I was, compromised, literally by the short hairs. So it seems that Joey and SW were telling the same story at the same time, and that's why her flashback ended up becoming his confession that he was telling the priest. So the priest asks, what did he do? And SW says, I'll tell you a story. There once were 3 brothers. One was smart, one was special, and one was lucky. And as he begins to tell this story, we get a flash of 3 silhouettes behind him, and it's obviously the Furman brothers that John had met previously. So Dickie is supposed to be the smart one, Richie is supposed to be the special one, and Lucky is supposed to be the lucky one. And over these silhouettes, SW is narrating, saying, and these 3 brothers, they were the most splendid of thieves. Like all thieves, they knew not to trust anyone, but they trusted each other, for nothing's like blood on blood. They also trusted a liar. And as he says this, we see the smiling silhouette of John Constantine, and his narration continues. This was a mistake, because a liar is never to be trusted. Then we get the silhouette of Dickie on a porch, and he is in a rocking chair, and he's kind of relaxing, and the narration says, now, the smart one, he knew that one day he would have to be an honest man. On that day he became honest, but no one trusted him. Then we get a panel of Richie in silhouette with his dog, and he's just standing on the top of a ridge, and the narration says, the special one, he didn't know any better, so he followed his smart brother. But his was the cruel honesty of nature, so everyone was afraid of him. Then we get a panel of the silhouette of Lucky smoking on the front of his car, and the narration continues, but the lucky one? He had a hunch that being smart or special was good, but being lucky was much better. And since there is no room for honesty and luck, anyone was worth a chance. So he remained a thief, though not a splendid one like before. He became petty, a useless thief, peddling junk out of the trunk of his car, unable to dream up the next big score because he wasn't special. Then we cut back to the present out of the silhouette panels, and SW is saying, nor was he smart enough to realize he had nothing to offer anyone, except a man who you might say had everything, a tortured king. And that tortured king is obviously SW referring to himself. So this is like his fable story way of telling the story of how he ended up working with the Furman brothers and eventually ended up getting lucky to go along with this deal to betray John. And he continues saying, this king had dealt with the brothers in the past, but then what are kings, if not the patrons of thieves? Now, the king, he knew that Lucky still had something valuable he could sell. So he made Lucky an offer, a mountain of gold. And we get a silhouette of SW talking to Lucky as he sits on the back of his car, and we see Fredo and SW's helicopter in the background. But the silhouette of Lucky is holding up his hands like he's saying no, and the narration continues. At first, Lucky refused. Too bad Lucky had a wife, because she convinced him to do what the king wanted. She realized that if he accepted, she would be the lucky one. And over that narration, we saw the silhouette of Lucky talking to his wife in the front of the car, and then one of just his wife in the car after she's convinced Lucky. And then we cut back to the present as Father Sean asks, what did the king want? And SW answers very bitterly, the liar. And as he says that, he's still in the garden talking to the father, but instead of like a silhouette extra panel, they just have the silhouette of John with a big shit-eating grin about to smoke in front of him. And so like the bitter look looks like he's literally looking at John right now. And Stanley continues saying, "The king wanted to hurt the liar. So the king gave Lucky a gun. And Lucky made certain the liar held it. When Lucky had the gun back in his hand, he put it to his head, and his wife became rich." And as he's telling this part, SW is putting like a finger gun under his chin, and then we see a silhouette of when Lucky blew his brains out. Then we get a panel of the silhouette of John sitting behind bars because he's been arrested, and over this, SW narrates, "The king's guards were in place to arrest the liar for the murder, and threw him in prison to rot until he died, which didn't take long." Then we cut out of that silhouette panel back to Stanley standing next to Father Sean, and he continues saying, "Only John was so entrenched in lying that his own death was a lie." And Father Sean asks, "And then?" Then we get a weird pause where SW's thinking, and then he stops the story there and goes back to the confession of what was happening in the club where he had just been whipped by Graham, and John now was standing in front of him, and he thought he was seeing a ghost maybe, and his penis was in John's hand. And SW says, "I came in his hand. He wiped his fingers clean on my face." And Father Sean looks disgusted as he says, "That's awful." And SW says, "It gets better. See, the king finally got what he really wanted all along." And we leave it there on that cliffhanger. So now I and you finally know who Stanley is in relation to John. And we're not sure if it's just the clock and the trick that John played on him when he was younger, why he wanted to get revenge on him. But it seems that's the most likely reason that we've been given so far as to why SW hates John so much. But we'll have to wait till next issue to see if that theory is correct. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.